So today we're going to start more three-dimensional geometry, and it's going to feel very basic, but I want to go over some of the vocabulary and make sure that you're very clear on what makes certain things get a certain label. And I really want you to be precise with the language that you use. So the first part of today, we're going to talk about 2D versus 3D shapes. Okay, and I have a picture up here. This would be considered a 2D shape, two-dimensional. 2D stands for two-dimensional. And we call it two-dimensional because it only has two, length and height. Well, I prefer length and width, but it only has two of them. Whatever you call them, length and width and height, whatever, there's only two of them for it. The label that we would give the answer is units squared, inches squared, feet squared, centimeters squared, etc. This one's all about two. These things happen to be flat. You could make them with a single piece of paper. You wouldn't have to fold them. It would just be a flat shape. Three-dimensional shapes, 3D is three-dimensional. Three-dimensional shapes have length and width and height. It has three dimensions. We talk about these with units cubed, so cubic feet, cubic meters, miles cubed. Sometimes you can flip the wording back and forth. These are what we would say have thickness to them. So if these are flat, these are thick. These are 2D, these are 3D. All right, let's look at some examples. Two-dimensional shapes, circles, semicircle. I disagree that that has two sides. I disagree that that has one side, but we're working with the pictures that we have. Triangles, squares, rectangles, all quadrilaterals, parallelograms, rhombuses, trapezoids, all those things we just studied. Pentagon has five sides. You don't need to know the names of these. They're just kind of fun trivia. Hexagon is six. Hepta is seven. Octagon is eight, like a stop sign. Nonagon is nine. And decagon is 10. They might be fun for like trivia night. But then we get to the three-dimensional shapes, and we have a sphere. You'll study that more in 8th grade. You've got a prism. This is actually another kind of prism, but it's a special name because it has a square base. A cube, which is another type of prism. A cylinder, which is another type of prism. A pyramid, and a cone. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the sphere and the cylinder and the cone. They fall, well, a sphere is its own thing. The cylinder and the cone fall under some of the stuff that we're going to study this year, but they get their own names because they're circles. And you'll hear me joke, circles think they're so special that they get their own name. This is really a circular prism and a circular pyramid, but we'll talk more about that. So these are flat, two dimensions, length and width. These have thickness to them, three dimensions, length, width, and height. All right, so let's talk about prisms, specifically prisms. They have two congruent bases, and congruent means that they are exactly the same. You could flatten them and smush them down, and the shapes would be exactly the same on top of each other. And they are spread apart by rectangles. We name these prisms by their base. So if I look at this red shape up here, this is what we would call a triangular prism because it has a triangle here. It has a triangle in the back that we can't kind of see because of how it's positioned. And then it has a rectangle here and a rectangle over here and a rectangle that's sitting down that separate these two triangles. So because it has the exact same base, top and bottom, and it's separated by rectangles, it has height, we consider it a triangular prism. This would be a rectangular prism. Now, it might be specifically a square. I'm not quite sure if these are exactly the same, but this is a rectangle. Back here would be a rectangle, and these are spaced out by rectangles. So we name them by the base, rectangular prism. We could also call it a square prism if we knew those were squares. And fun fact, if the rectangles in the middle were squares and the bases are squares, we call it a cube. The only one that gets a special name because all six faces are exactly the same. Okay, moving on to this green one. This is a pentagonal prism, pentagon with an AL on the end. So here's a five-sided figure. In the back here would be another five-sided figure, exactly the same if I was to squish them together. And then the rectangles in the middle. Okay, so it's kind of like a pentagonal or pentagon box. This would be a hexagonal, octagonal, and I didn't count the number of sides. It's approaching a circle. Did you know that the more sides something has, the closer it gets to being a circle? If this was in fact truly a circle, then it would be considered a cylinder. All right, so those are prisms, exactly the same. Think of a box, exactly the same top and bottom, spread by rectangles in the middle. All right, let's talk about pyramids. Just like the pyramids in Egypt, if you've studied them in social studies class, these have one base and they rise to a single point. Okay, so if you can get that picture in your head of the pyramids in Egypt, how they kind of go up to that one point, you'll remember what a pyramid is. And we name these by their bases also. So if this has a square on the bottom and it rises to a single point, that's considered a square pyramid. This has a triangle on the bottom and it goes to a single point, that's a triangular pyramid. This has a six-sided figure, a hexagon, goes to a single point. We call this a hexagonal pyramid. And if it has a circle on the bottom and goes to a point, it's a cone. So special, not called a circular pyramid, called a cone. Okay, here's comparing what they would look like. So if this has a triangle base and this has a triangle base, you can see here, this looks more like a box where this goes up to a point. A square prism, square base, square base. The pyramid goes to a point. This is a box. Rectangular bases, rectangular base. This goes to a point, so it's a pyramid. This is a box. Pentagon and pentagon goes to a point. Two bases, that's a box. Hexagon and hexagon goes to a point. Octagon, octagon, this one goes to a point. So today your task is going to be easy. It's going to be sorting different pictures into two-dimensional versus three-dimensional, and then a second set of pictures sorting them between prisms and pyramids.